All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? People in the back? Awesome. Well, before we get started, I want to say thank you for the intro. And if it's okay, I would like to quickly tell you guys a little bit about myself. My name is Ben Sadeghipour. Most people online know me as Nahamsek. As mentioned, I'm an ethical hacker, bug bounty hunter. I'd like to say hacker. We've fought for 10 years to make sure we change the definition of the term hacker from a cyber criminal to someone that's doing good in the world. So in short, I am a hacker, and I work as, after 10 years of doing hacking officially as my daytime job, I've just transitioned into a CEO for a company called Hacking Hub that I founded with two of my other hacker friends, where we train the next generation of hackers. And on the side, I do a lot of pen tests, bug bounties, and red teaming. And I also make content on YouTube to help people get into cybersecurity. So if your goal is to transition, whether you're in IT, you're a developer, any of the above, anything in tech pretty much, that you have a little bit of background in tech, I try to push those folks into cybersecurity through my content that I make on YouTube. So if you want to look me up, it's the same name on all social media platforms as well. And just recently, to segue a little bit about my hacking career, just recently in Las Vegas, I was given the most valuable hacker title by a company named HackerOne. HackerOne is a leading bug bounty platform. They pretty much connect hackers to companies, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But they throw these events, they organize these massive hacking events every year or every couple of months around the world. So the recent one they just did was in Scotland, and before that it was in Vegas. That's where they fly 50 to 100 top hackers in the world on their platforms, and they pay them money to pretty much hack into these companies. And the one that I was given was their flagship event in Vegas, which is where DEF CON happens and Black Hat happens. They did this event with TikTok and Epic Games, and me and the two gentlemen that you see in the picture with me were awarded the most valuable hacker because we found the most critical bugs in Epic Games and TikTok. I've mentioned bug bounties. I know Chris also asked about bug bounties, but can I one more time get you to give me a hint if you know what a bug bounty is? Wow, a lot more this time. Okay. I say this at every conference I go to. The first question I ask the audience is, does anybody know what a bug bounty is? And every time I've asked this question, the number of hands raised. Even last week when we did another conference with the YOW team, there was less hands, and today is a lot more hands. So it makes my job a little bit easier to explain this. Any hackers in the audience? Okay, we got to work on this one. Cool. So to mention a couple of companies I've hacked into, these are just a number of the ones that I've hacked into. If there's a phone on your, it's an application on your phone, the chances are I've quote unquote hacked their company. It doesn't mean that I've breached the company, it just means I've found some security vulnerability in there and they've awarded me for it. But these ones are probably my most memorable, and those are the ones that probably everybody knows, every single one of them. You probably use, except Lyft, it's a very much American thing, but think about Lyft as like a different version of Uber for the States. And yeah, bug bounties have been insane. It's originally, when I would do these talks, we would say bug bounties pay you anywhere from $100 to $15,000. That was back in 2016, 2017. And then now recently, I can say bug bounties pay you anywhere from $100 all the way to $2 million, thanks to Bitcoin, because a lot of these cryptocurrency companies, a lot of these contracts, a lot of these platforms that are made for trading, they have a lot of money being handled, right? So they offer a large bounty because of their the attack and the threat that they have to go against. So I've personally been lucky and fortunate enough to be able to do $1 million since going full-time with bug bounties in 2022. So this wasn't my full-time gig. I actually had a daytime job for 6-7 years, and I did a little bit of moonlighting as a hacker, and then for 2 years I did this full-time, and then I realized I like teaching, and I've transitioned over to teaching now. As I've gone through years of doing my bug bounty, it's just become way, way easier with AI. It's just easier to be able to get solutions and answers and just having a second brain to rely on. Because usually, I think a lot of you will also relate to this, is you go to Google, type in, how do I do this? Most basic example that I have to still do to this day is, how do I do a for loop in Bash? So you put that in there, and then you probably find some Stack Overflow article, and people are like shaming you should have looked for it and whatever. Like, it's just not easy. It's just you have to go through, you have to do research for a simple answer, right? It's just not as straightforward. But now, it's way easier. You go to AI and say, hey, I want to do this thing, or I'm looking at this specific problem. Give me 15 solutions. It will give you 15 ways to write a for loop. I mean, I don't know if there's 15 ways, but it's going to find a way to give you 15 ways to do one specific problem, right? And it doesn't stop there. It just, and I know I'm not the only person doing it, because if you have looked at Stack Overflow's recent data, they have been drastically dropping in traffic as well. So I know a lot of developers are also relying on AI. But that's not the only way you can use AI. You can also use it to get context. You can give it a form or a PDF, for example, and say, give me, analyze this and give me X, Y, and Z. Or you can say, for me, in my case, I can say, hey, help me figure out what I'm looking at. If I don't have an idea about this programming language, or whatever that case may be. You can have it give you proof of concept, which I'll show you in just a bit. It can actually code for you. I know it's not good to rely and put that code in production, but for somebody like me that wants to automate just tedious tasks and they don't want to spend time writing that piece of code, I'm not really good at coding, which we'll talk about in just a bit, but that is a great way for me to go and say, hey, write me this piece of code that does these specific things, gives it to you, you can use it for that task that you have. But then you can also have some language barriers, which I'll show an example of. You can analyze and just create more data, which is just amazing, because if you give it a JSON file, for example, and you need it to analyze that data, you're going to have to find some patterns for yourself, maybe do some JQ or grep to find data. But with AI, it's a lot easier to do those things, right? So I call this applied AI for hackers, and you can just use this as a second brain just to process things easier, also make sense of things that you're looking at. And anyone know these two logos? Okay, so Claude and ChatGPT are typically the two models that most people use, including myself a lot of times. But there's also a third model that I've been using a lot, which is White Rabbit Neo, and I'll show you why I use White Rabbit Neo, just an example, because I think it'll be more interesting if I show you instead of telling you. So if you go into ChatGPT today and you ask it for anything hacking related, it comes back and says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's gone to the point that it's just gotten shorter and shorter with me every time I ask it something for hacking. It just says, I can't. Like, I can't help you. And you have to find a way around it, right? I was, after live saying, I'm helping my grandma with her homework and I want to get this thing done, and it would give me that, right? So not fun. It's not as easy. Same thing with Claude. Claude is even better. Claude starts to gaslight you into what you're doing is wrong, and then starts to tell you how to do it right as a developer, which is not something I asked for. This is the same question I asked in my last slide, and I said, I want to just give me an XSS payload. It's just a malicious JavaScript code that I wanted, nothing fancy. And it just says, no, let me show you how to be better. That's not what I want. So the third option is using White Rabbit Neo, and White Rabbit Neo is like, yes, I got you. I'll give you this code, because they are trained to be your cybersecurity co-pilot, as you want to call it, like your model for cybersecurity. There is no rejection with White Rabbit Neo, and I love it because this just makes my life easier. Because originally I would spend just time after time trying to come up with a lie. Like, I feel like a teenager lying to my parents, like, hey, I want to do this thing, can you help me? And it just made it easier. So you also have this, if you ever wanted to do some cybersecurity stuff, obviously ethical, this is a good option to go and learn from it. There is no rejection. So let's talk about hacking now a little bit. Anyone here know what an asset discovery means? What the term could be? A couple of hands? Cool. Well, asset discovery is pretty much the process I call like recon. You have the reconnaissance, you go after a company. This could be getting a list of their employees, their buildings. It could be their digital assets online, their web apps, their mobile apps, their devices that they sell, everything that could get connected back to a company. As bug bounty hunters, this is a massive role that I have to play and I have to play into to find assets to hack on that could maybe give me access to a production server, for example, right? So if you want to picture it, let's imagine Uber. Uber owns Uber Eats. They own Postmates, and Uber and some other random company that I can't think of the name, but they all are owned under this company named Uber, and they all also have their own staging, development. They have their own production servers, internal assets, their DevOps, CI/CD, all that good stuff, right? They have this massive attack surface that you have to understand, and in some cases, it looks like this. You find that core www.uber.com, and then from there you get pointed to app.uber, and app.uber points to another API, and that API points to another one, and then this is what an infrastructure would look like, and all those are different nodes and assets that you can go after. So what I was showing earlier, with each of those last boxes, that could be pretty much one of those nodes, and it's really hard to make sense of, especially if you're doing this on your free time to make extra cash. Because with bug bounties is, however much time I put in is gonna be what I'm gonna not get back, right? And that bounty may not be worth it. So I was doing this with NASA. They actually have a vuln disclosure program, which they don't pay you for your work, They don't make you an astronaut. I found that out. And then also they don't give you anything, but it's NASA. Like, why would I not want to hack into NASA? And I went after their assets, and this is kind of what all of NASA's assets kind of look like. Yeah, there's tools you can use out there that are open source. I use a tool called SubFinder. You just go in there, you can configure it with other databases. But what they do is, if anyone here knows like CRT.sh, it's like cert.sh, it's a open source project that allows you to see all the SSL certs for a domain or company. They use a bunch of those, collect all the domains, and then give it to you. Mine's a little bit configured differently, but if you look down there, you can see for NASA that I have 27,188 domains. Right? These are all the assets that I have found under nasa.gov by doing a simple search. There's probably way more than this, but this is just what I have found. Running a tool for 3 minutes just spits out this entire tool. So I want to make sense of it. I dump this into one of the LLMs, and I go, okay, make sense of this data. There's 27,000 domains. What can we do with all this? And it starts to tell you some like patterns that it's found. Like, hey, this one is commonly used for internal databases, all the way through this UAT one stands for user acceptance testing, which is a part of their DevOps lifecycle. Doesn't make sense that this is true or not, but this is just based on the naming conventions of all these patterns, right? Because most companies usually have something like, internal.site.com for all their internal stuff. They have tools, they have, DevOps. Those domains are usually fairly the same across all the companies. But this is what kind of tells you it's cool to know this, because now I can say, okay, if I want to go after some of the internal assets, then I'll go after this specific environment. If I wanted to do internal tools, for example, I can go to line 6 and look at those, for example, right? But it's good, but not good enough. There's also the other option to write your own prompt. You tell the LLM that you're using, this is a bash script that I have that just pushes that to the LLM's API and says, hey, which, by the way, the LLM tool that I'm using is by Simon W. It's just an agent that you can interact with any models out there. But I'm just saying, hey, you're looking at a list of assets that belong to an organization. I want you to analyze this list and then identify any internal CI/CD, continuous integration and development, or DevOps applications from this list. And then I just give it some examples because I want to really narrow down the things that I'm going after. And that is, think about like GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, Splunk, Jira. Those are the things that a lot of developers use in their day-to-day for building apps, right? So I want to find those, because if those are exposed, then we can have some fun. And cool, it can come back and says, found it. Out of the 27,000 domains that you have given me, these are the ones that look like could be interesting. There's Jenkins, there is Grafana, GitLab, and I don't know whether the ECG data node is, but there's some cool apps to look after. And I wanted to go specifically after GitLab, because GitLab is a fun one to get into, because everybody somehow knows how to misconfigure their GitLab enterprise. Not the one that's hosted on GitLab itself, but if you're self-hosting a GitLab on your company's infrastructure and it's exposed to the world, I can guarantee you at some point someone's got unauthorized access to it. And those are because not only you can misconfigure them, but they come out with vulnerabilities for these tools every month. GitLab just had one 2 months ago about being able to bypass authentication if you had SSO, for example, enabled. But there's this that you always see, no matter what. Companies configure GitLab where you have to log in order to see data behind it. Well, there's this thing called Explore. And a lot of times people forget to make this accessible to people that are authorized and logged in. Sometimes that gives you access to just a GitLab dashboard that you're not logged in, and you can just click and look at the projects and look at the source of the projects. Sometimes it says, nope, you go back to the login. So this was my case this time. But that doesn't still necessarily mean that I can't get access to the data behind it, because luckily we have the API that goes with it. You also have to make sure that's not accessible to unauthorized users. Because if you hit that endpoint, what it does is it just spits out all the projects that you may have misconfigured the access to. Even though you didn't want it to be open to the world, somehow I can see the link to all of those. And if I just click right here on the README file right here, what happens is it just takes me to the README on GitLab and opens it up. So if it's accessible like this, click on those links and it just takes you to the source, and you can see everything without doing anything with Git at all. So that's just one way of doing it. But then when you have that, it's just you're going through garbage. I call this dumpster diving, digital dumpster diving. And it's just you have to review code. You have to find things that could be valuable. In some cases, I found production keys. For one of the largest gaming companies out there. I did the same exact thing. I was just going through the builds for it, and I found their production build key for GitLab, so I could just do whatever I wanted to with that instance. It was just in those logs, right? For this one specifically, I came across this endpoint on GitLab that was called internal. So if you hit /internal on that GitLab instance that was owned by NASA, it would assume that you're logged in because you could see the page. So it assumed if you can see this page and you click on these links that I have, I'm going to authorize you to all these applications that are used internally. I don't know what this one was. This was just called the Science Data Transfer Protocol. I'm assuming they can just transfer files or something like that for it. I could just see all the users and have some edit options. This was cool, but this one is even cooler because this is Netbox. Anyone know what Netbox does? It actually allows you to control the power for buildings. So I could pretty much go in there and I could just go to the storage, for example. You can see the power thing, can turn it off. You can see there's interfaces, console ports, servers, power ports, power outlets. I could just turn all of those off if I wanted to. That's what I assume it does. Honestly, seeing something like this for me is very scary, especially because it's the government. I'm not going to click and look at it, but just seeing those and looking at what Netbox says online, I kind of draw the conclusion that that's what it does. So that's one way of doing this with NASA. And what I was saying earlier about not giving you any rewards, they just give you a fancy letter that says, hey, we acknowledge you for hacking NASA. We're not sending you to space, but here's a thank you note instead. So that's just one of the applications of using LLMs or AI just to have a brain that does the work for you. If I wanted to go through those 27,000 domains, I would have to come up with a lot of different grep patterns maybe. So I have to sit there and grep for Jenkins, grep for GitLab, whatever one that I'm looking for, I would have to grep through all those domains, dump them into a file, do some reconnaissance on it versus just saying, hey, find this for me, right? So that's one application of using AI for your data. Anyone know what this vulnerability type is? An IDOR? It's a fun one, I promise. So what happens usually is when you purchase something or you go to a web page that shows you some data, there's always some sort of a request happening in the background. So if I say, hey, I want you to show me my invoice for my purchase number this, it passes that ID to a GraphQL, a REST API, or AJAX request, whatever it is. It sends out a request, and it goes, here's your invoice, right? Very straightforward. And sometimes it looks like this. There's a URL, you go to your shopping site, and it just goes API invoice in the background, and that invoice detail gets shown on this display, right? Well, there's something really cool about these numbers that are integers. Usually they're just, you can increment and decrement those numbers. So if I go from 4.1 to 4.0, it may show me an invoice that belongs to somebody else. So you change that to a 0, you go through the same process. Instead of 741, you go show me 740, and it just shows you the invoice for somebody else, which may have their phone number, their address, the last 4 digits of their credit card number, and so on, right? But the key here is this is a number that I can guess, right? It's not always that easy because you have your integers that are super easy. It goes from 1 to 9999999, whatever that last one is, and usually when you make a purchase, you're probably the last number, so you can go back a couple and find it. You have your UUIDs, they're sometimes timestamp mixed with something else. Then you have your first and last name sometimes. It could be your first dot last name, first name dot last. All these different combinations. And the hardest one is the last one, which is country-based, because if you're looking at an API in the US, probably, Smith is the #1 last name that I can probably guess. But I couldn't do that in Australia, probably. I couldn't do that in Argentina or Peru or some other country. And this is also what AI looks. It thinks what this IDOR looks like when you ask it for an image. So let's talk about unauthorized access to API leaks users' PII, including their social security number, phone number, address, and national ID card. So I found this URL. Doesn't matter how I found it. I just came across this URL on Google, let's say. And when I click it, it is going to just show me information for that specific user, right? It says, A. Hernandez, this is your full name, your ID number, your phone number, your email address, all that stuff, right? So I go to the bug bounty program, and this is a massive credit company that works across the globe. You guys could probably guess what they are. But I send that URL to them like, hey, if you go to this URL, this is not my data. It's leaking someone else's information. You should probably fix it. And they came back and said, nope, based on what we see, this is a valid vulnerability, but you have to know their username and able to access that, right? So this part, the username is A Hernandez 88. You need to know that in order for us to be able to find this vulnerability valid. It's just very much based by this case by case pretty much. So we go to the drawing board, and this is kind of what we're looking for. The first option is to actually brute force for usernames. You can use dictionary files and say, hey, go online and find the most common usernames and try it out. But that's a little bit hard because you're probably not going to find those random usernames on this website. It's a professional website, right? So we go and look at the username itself, and in this case it's A Hernandez, and then there's 2 numbers at the end. So our first response is to go after the numbers and try A Hernandez 1, and that doesn't work. So we try 2. We can automate this from 1 to 100 and see what comes back, but most of those don't do anything. There may be an A Hernandez 77, but that's just so random. There's no logic in that, right? So I drop the 1 and I start focusing on A Hernandez on its own, and that one actually works without a number. So we know A Hernandez without a number is a valid username that's different than A Hernandez 88, right? But what happens if we do B Hernandez? That one also works. What if we do C Hernandez? We just go down the alphabet and we see Hernandez as valid, and as long as we have some common name that starts with A, B, C, D, all the way through those letters with the last name Hernandez, we're able to find a user with information that's going to come back with the API and say, here's the information, right? So Hernandez becomes the thing that we want to go to, and actually I like this version better. So we go back to AI and we ask it for some more. So what I do here with AI is I ask it, hey, what are the top 10 most popular last names in South America? And it gives me a list. I probably wouldn't have guessed most of these. I could probably go to Google and look at some stats online and do my own research, but why would I spend 3 hours when I can just go and spend 3 minutes asking AI for this? And it gives you Gonzalez, Rodriguez, Martinez, Lopez, Perez, Gomez. You go down the list. And we go back to our request. So we do the same thing. We go, is A Rodriguez a thing? Cool. A Martinez a thing? Cool. A Gonzalez? Yep. So now we realize it's first initial, last name. And if we go through every single alphabet, every single letter of the alphabet with every last name that we have a good couple of hundred usernames to go back to and send it to them. So you go from this to actually the company acknowledging your vulnerability and giving you a max bounty of $3,000 for that finding. So we just went from, nope, you can't do anything with this unless you know your username, to getting a bounty from it just by taking a list of data that is generated by AI that we could probably find, but probably a lot easier to do it with AI anyways. And that also helps with the language barrier, because sometimes even if I can do that with a South American company, what if the API itself is a different language, right? I could also use AI and say, hey, here's a list of all these APIs. Can you guess what the user profile API is in that language? So that language barrier is completely gone, and you have something that understands context and gives you an accurate list of results based on the context of what you're working with. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, something a little bit more technical. I know that one was super easy. You change a number to another, suddenly you're a hacker and you can find vulnerabilities. That's still very valid, by the way. That vulnerability still happens to this day. I've started looking for those 10 years ago, and they still happen. It's just gotten harder to find, but it's just become deeper to go through the application to find it. But I want to make sure I make you understand that just because it sounds super easy doesn't mean that you can't still find those. Anybody here work with IIS, Windows apps? Anyone know what this vulnerability is? Okay, so this vulnerability, what it does is, it's called the IIS short name enumeration. It allows you to enumerate a short list of file names. It lets you pretty much guess what the first 6 letters of a file on the web server is, and then also allows you to find out what is the extension for it. And if you're wondering, who cares if you find some file on a server, but imagine if that was your backups folder, for example, and you have a backup laying around. You may not make that mistake, but a lot of developers make that mistake of leaving it behind. That could be your logs folder. That could be an admin panel, for example, that has an upload file, which I'll show some examples of. But that's just why we're looking for these files. We're looking for specific leads that could give us access to that web server, for example. In this case, we're going to try and enumerate a file that starts with AC secret. That's the file we're going after, and this ugly thing is the request that you make to get to it. There are tools that make it easier, but I want to quickly just kind of explain what they look like. The way it works is you send a request. Based on your request, if it comes back with a 404, it is a valid file. So if you say, hey, does it start with the letter A? If it says 404, that means there's a file that starts with the letter A. If it says 400, it means that it doesn't exist. And this is kind of what it looks like. So we send a request, we say, do you have any files? We have to always do the star tilde 1 star slash ASPX. Do you have any files on the server? 404 means, yep, I have files, you can look for it. Okay, cool. Does it start with the letter A? And it comes back as a 404, we know, okay, the first letter is A, we can move to the second letter, right? So now we go, does it start with another A? And it comes back as 400, we go, okay, it's not an A, let's try B. It's not a B, let's try C. So we know AC is what we're looking for. Then we can ask it another question and say, hey, with a question mark, we ask, is it 3 letters? Because if it comes back as a 404, then we know it's 3 letters. But if it comes back as 400, then we know it's 6 digits or more. This bug only gives you the first 6 digits. So it could be 20 digits, 20 letters long, it could be 6, but it gives you the first 6. And now we know, okay, it's at least maybe 6 if I do the 4 question marks. So we go all the way through, all the letters, and we get AC, SECR. So it's AC secret of some sort. We don't know what it is, but we can move to the next phase of this, and that is to figure out, is it a folder or is this a, file with an extension? So same thing. We ask it the next question. Hey, are you a folder with that slash? And it says 400. Nope. If we do a star.question, then we know that that is an extension with 3 letters that we can guess. So we start, is it an A? Obviously not. We do H. Okay, then we can guess probably HTML or HTML. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we know what the file name is, right? We know it could be AC secret, but it could also be AC secret. You may never find this because it's hidden. It could be AC secret file, AC secretary. It could be secrecy, all these different files, right? Obviously, in the context of like some folders, it's probably easier. If you see something like user E, that's probably like user edit, maybe. So we can kind of like draw conclusions, but it's also still really hard. But you have tools that you can just, if you have a list, you can give it the list, and it will look and see if that file exists on the server, right? Well, in my case, I was hacking on a massive beverage company, and I found this thing, and it came back, and if you look, there's 2 files that I've hidden in there because the company name's in it, but you can see that it's a DLL file. And if you've done any .NET development, you know that DLLs usually have the source code of the API, but there's also interesting files in there that I give it to White Rabbit Neo, the agent that I use, and it comes back and says, you should look at the backup file, you should look at that .dll, and the zip file is the most important, but it's probably the hardest to look for because if it's backup, and if we know the date for that backup number could be a different bunch of formats, right? It could be date, so it could be month, day, year, it could be day, month, year, then it could be dots in the middle, it could be dashes, it could be no dashes, spaces, things like that. So it becomes really hard to guess. But that DLL looks really interesting. So that's the one that I'm going to go after. So the DLL, we want to see if we can guess what the name is for it, right? And if you go to the website, this is what the website looks like. You see at the top, there's an API button. If you click on the API, it just shows you what the API looks like. But it requires that you have a username and password in order to be able to see, to interact with the API itself. Normal stuff. So the company, we're going to call it NameCo to make it easier. So I don't leak this customer's name, but also we can kind of understand how it works. What we're doing here is we're going to go to our White Rabbit Neo and say, do you know what this vulnerability is? The I is short name enumeration. It says, yep. And I say, okay, here's a file that I'm going after. It's nameco.dll. I want you to give me some names that could be after that company's name that could potentially give me that DLL if it's an API. How do I do this, right? So it gives you a lot of different combinations. It's like your API, web service, API wrapper, API handler, web APIs, all those different combinations are things that I would have to think about, which, to be honest, I probably couldn't have guessed it because it's just a lot. I don't know how a developer would name those, right? There's some standard names that you can use, but coming up with those would be probably a lot harder. So what it does is it gives you that list, and you ask it, hey, now, the name co, it could be name co, it could be name company, it could be name corp, it could be name corporate. Make a list for me, and it gives you this entire list. Then you go back and you go, okay, I want to try all of these different combinations with all the different name combinations for the company, and you find, for example, it's name corporate API.dll, okay? And it gives you access to that file. So if you go back to the company and you go to that, if we go to that API for name corp API, it actually downloads finally, and we have a DLL that we can reverse. You can use some online tools, you can use some IDEs, you can reverse engineer it, but this is kind of what it looks like when you extract the entire DLL. You see they have the API, they have some of their CRM source code, but the cool thing is if you just run a grep across the entire file, and if you don't know what grep is, you can just search through all these files for a specific keyword, just a search through your terminal. I just did a search for password, and it came back and gave me a password. Can anyone guess what that password was used for? For the API. So I can actually go in there. This is a web proxy tool that I use. I'm just using it to create my HTTP request. I give it my authorization bearer, or the basic bearer, actually. It's not a bearer, it's the basic authorization, a base 64 of the username and password that I have in this slide, and I'm logged in. And if you look at the documentation for this API, it actually has an upload that allows you to upload any files you want to that web server. That includes ASP files, that include .exe files, whatever you want to upload, it allows you to upload it. So I go back to my good friend here and I say, hey, can you give me a web shell written in ASP or ASPX.NET that I can just run server commands on there? And it gives you one, you upload it, and then this is our box now. So we can actually interact with it, delete files, remove files. Actually, funny enough, this was on their Azure account, and I could actually directly access with other assets in there as well. So yeah, that's another way of using AI. It's just that typically what I would do is I would write a script and give it the file name and say, try all these words in this dictionary and see which one comes back, and you're throwing random garbage at the wall and hope that something sticks. With AI, I could be very concise of, this is what I'm looking at. Give me file names based on the data that you have, and luckily that name worked. I also want to give a quick shout out to my buddies Shubs and Renz. Shubs is actually an Australian hacker here in Australia. He's in Sydney, I think, in that area. But Ren's also another hacker that I collaborated with through finding that vulnerability. So I kind of want to acknowledge them as well. All right, one last vulnerability. You guys okay with one more? Yep. Yeah? Very cool. Okay, any Java developers? Any guesses about what zip slip could be? It sounds weird, but it's a real vulnerability. Okay. Well, zip slip allows you to upload a zip file, a compressed file. And what you can do within that file is you can specify an existing file on that web server to overwrite by traversing out of it. So you go, hey, as soon as you decompress or unzip this file, look for this specific route and rewrite it. It only works if that file exists. So you can't just say, hey, I want to write a new file into the etc folder. But if you have access to overwrite etc password, you can say, hey, here's my version of etc password, overwrite it, okay? That's very, very important because it's not going to work otherwise. I already asked any Java developers, that is probably one of your biggest nightmares, other than the fact that you work in Java. I couldn't do it. I had to do it through university, and I hated every day of it. So shout out to you for making a career out of it. So this is what it would look like if we created a proof of concept that works, okay? You would have to say, hey, I want to traverse out. You know, if we're in 9 directories deep in home/user/www/whatever, all the way through, I want to write this file. We can traverse out of it. You need to write a Python script to do this. I'll show you why in just a bit. And you can also, you have to know that file exists, right? So just to give you an idea of like, okay, you can write a file to my server, so what? Think about if I replace your company's index file, for example, or I can override an authorized key for your SSH and I can just SSH that box, right? Those are all the possibilities of it. But I have a better one that I will just share in just a bit. So our first step is write a Python script, because if you go into your terminal and you say, create this zip called zip slip and then give it that file, that will not work. It's just going to take it too literal and think like the / slashes is where you want it to go to find that file. It's going to come back and say, I did not find that file that you're giving me. There's an error. You have to fix it. So we're going to go to White Rabbit Neo again and say, hey, I want you to create a piece of code in Python for me. And I wanted to do these 3 things. First is I wanted to have a flag called n for name, so you can give it a file name. That's going to create. And then you're going to give it a path to a file that already exists. And then it's going to take a z argument for the number of paths that we want to traverse out of. So that's the number of folders we want to go out of. And you tell it, this is how I want it to work. I want the person using this script to write Python, zipslip.py, file name, and the path, and then z, the number of / slashes that I want to give it. So you give it exactly how you want the tool to work, because if you don't, it's going to make some weird stuff for you. So you give it that, it gives you a piece of code, and we go back into our terminal, and we say, hey, run this file, and this is the panel.jsp is the file that exists on my box, and I want to write it to the root of that server, okay? Because I think that file exists. So we have that part done. But the second part is knowing a file on the system to write. Obviously, writing an authorized SSH pad isn't really real. It's not realistic. You probably don't have access to write that file or overwrite the file. But there are some files that a lot of people leave behind. Does anyone know this folder? It's the examples folder of Tomcat. So if you're running Java on Tomcat, for some god-awful reason, people love leaving this behind. It doesn't do anything. It's just examples of JSP files. There used to be vulnerabilities in them back 10 years ago, but nowadays it has no reason for it to be online, especially if you're not testing apps with Java and it's a production system. But this folder specifically is a really good place to overwrite files into a web server of an application running and being vulnerable to zip slip. So what we do is we want to find out where are the most common places Java applications are running from. Where is the most common place Tomcat is installed, right? Usually it's the top two. I've seen mostly in user local. That's where people install it. But some people like to change it. It changes depending on who's writing that piece of code. But if you wanted to do this, this is really hard to do it on your own because you have to go find people's code on Stack Overflow, look for their errors, go to GitHub projects back in the day and look for those errors to have a list of these that could be handy at some point. And you may never use them, or if you find them at some point, you have to just go through that entire process and look for these pads. But luckily, we have a tool that can give this data to us. So this is what an example looks like. If you go to an example, this one is simple tag book.jsp. It's literally just a bunch of text. There's nothing, there's no functionality to it. But our goal is to overwrite that. So what we're going to do is, now that we have our path that we want, book.jsp, we're going to put the contents that we want into book.jsp. So it goes from this one to what we want it to be. It could be a troll message, it could be a web shell. And then we're going to loop through all of those paths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use all these paths and create proof of concepts with each of those. Because I don't know, I'm brute forcing at this point. I don't know where you have installed your Java apps, but I know it's probably one of these. And I'm going to make a proof of concept with a zip file, one per path, and then upload it. So this is what it kind of looks like. We're going to make it, and it's going to put it in there. But just to make it easier, I'm just going to give you guys a demo of it. There we go. Demo works. Cool. So this is just a lab that I created because I couldn't. It's really hard to show an example of this in a live company without leaking who the company was. So this is just a lab. If you're familiar with Sneak, they have a bunch of labs like this. This is one of their labs that I'm using. But I'm using this file uploader thing. I'm going into my book.jsp. This is our file that we have, and it's the same thing as that ASPX file that I showed you in the last example. It allows me to run arbitrary Linux commands or operating system commands on this box. And we have it saved as book.jsp, and I'm making my first proof of concept. I say, hey, poc.zip has this path that I want to create, and if you look, the two paths are different. I'm going after two different paths. I'm going to highlight them right here really quickly. You can see this one is in lib Tomcat, and the other one is in user local Tomcat, okay? So I know where it's installed because it's my local machine, so I've only made two of them just for the sake of example. So I upload my first one. I upload it, I go back to this page. This is what it looked like, so I'm refreshing it to see if I was able to successfully override it. So we refresh the page, nothing, and we go back to our upload. We do our second one, go back to our page, and if we refresh, we can see that the contents changed, and we're able to actually override this file, which also allows us to run arbitrary commands on this machine. And I think in this example, I write a file to the web root or the root of the server, and then I look for it. So that allows me to just randomly get access to this web server by just knowing paths. It's also a good case of if you don't need it, just get rid of it. If a folder or a file or an endpoint is not needed, delete it. It may not be a problem now, but it could become a problem sometimes in the near future. So that was the demo for it. And before I wrap up, I'm going to kind of give you some final thoughts of what I would suggest doing with AI. I think it's just massively growing, honestly. I know with writing code, it's probably a lot harder to use it. I know there's a lot of hot takes on whether or not you should use code that's created by AI. For somebody like me, I use the crap out of the code that gets generated by AI because no one else sees it, and it's just based on the tasks that I want to accomplish. So for those reasons, I genuinely enjoy using it. And to be very honest, I don't know how to write code. It sounds really weird that I can break into companies, but I can't write code. And that's because I just learned maybe 10% of every programming language just so I can understand the basics of how to interact with these web apps. Everything else is just based on assumptions that I have to make. And it's honestly a lot better not knowing how to code, because some of the stuff that I do, it never makes sense to any of my developer friends. They're like, well, why'd you think that? Because logically it doesn't make sense. I don't have that logic of being a developer because I don't code. I'm not put into that box like you guys are put in. So instead of, there is some pros and cons to it. I have friends of mine that are very good at Java. They're reviewing code and finding vulnerabilities. I have to do a black box approach and look for those vulnerabilities based on just what I'm seeing on the browser. And honestly, with the context of language barriers, it's been a game changer as well. The one thing that I would also say is just context. You're not doing random searches without telling it what you're looking for. I can tell AI, hey, this is what I'm working on as context for you. This is what I'm doing. Here's a white paper that I've read, or here's a YouTube video's text that I can throw in there and say, I'm trying to do these things based on this, help me do X, Y, and Z. So having something that knows the context of what you're working with has also been a game changer. With that said, I would love to open up some time for questions. If you guys have any questions about bug bounties, hacking, some of the slides that I put up. I know one question that I get a lot is if I'm going to get replaced by AI, and I'm going to just put that up there while we talk. I'm hoping I don't get replaced by it. Honestly, it's replacing a lot of my, it's already replacing a lot of my boring processes that I would probably hire someone to do, or write a script to do every day. So that's become a part of it, but hopefully it doesn't make my skills obsolete anytime soon.